Hey folks, welcome back to American History Live on Thursday afternoons. Once again, it'd be nice to know if I'm actually broadcasting. Sometimes the software is a little wonky, so if anybody's here, go ahead and send me some kind of a signal. And there you are. Hey, Julie. First, my usual disclaimer. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history, and I am doing these on my own without speaking for my employer. Although, as I say, I don't think my employer would have a problem with me doing it. I just want to make sure that people understand that if I say something that offends them, that they should not feel obliged to take it back to my dean. Anyway, so what I want to do today with this trip through American history is, as I said to you last week, my favorite material of all, except for last week and probably next week and maybe the week after that. But what you'll find, I think, this week is really new stuff, or rather stuff you've heard about before, but that I might be putting together in a way that you don't expect. And it's a great deal of fun for me because this is some very new material for me that is actually kind of new for everybody, and I'll be able to tell you about it today. So just as a reminder, what I'm doing is I'm trying to walk you through American history along the thesis that there is fundamentally an American paradox in the sense that American equality from the very beginning has depended on American inequality. And as a result, any time that people of color and women seem to be approaching terms of equality with the elite white man or the regular white man who, I'm sorry, I need to turn my phone off, who control politics, whenever that happens, the people who are in charge, oligarchs, are able to use their language of what I'm calling the paradox, the corollary to the American paradox, the idea that if you let women and people of color get an equal say in American society, it will diminish the equality or destroy the equality of the white men who have previously controlled it. And so the oligarchs are able to say that, that they will protect liberty for white men by keeping women and people of color from having a say in American society. And as they do so, they are able to create an oligarchy that challenges our democracy. And I've argued that that happened in the 1850s. That was, I think, the first time I did one of these. And now I'm walking you through how it happened after that. And so what I'm really doing over the last series of these 8 lectures is to talk about how that theme played out from the Civil War to the present. And where we are right now is in the late 19th century after the Reconstruction lecture I did last week. So let's get to it. I'm laughing. Somebody noticed I cleaned up the bookshelves because a friend of mine who's probably watching right now said, come on, Heather, get with the program. So I'm with the program. Someday maybe I'll take you guys through a tour of what's actually on these bookshelves. All right, so I talked a lot last week about the perception of the American West and how the American cowboy comes to represent the American who wants nothing from the government and who stands against this idea of what Easterners are calling communism. Remember, in a very different sense than it's going to be used after 1917, but Americans get very concerned about communism in the 1870s, and by that they mean a government in which poor people, largely people of color or immigrants, remember women aren't voting at this point, are able to have a say in society and therefore vote for politicians who will give them programs that will cost tax dollars. And because white men are the only ones who really have property to tax, not exclusively, but largely, that essentially means a redistribution of wealth from men of property to people of color, or later on to women. As I say, women don't have a say in this yet. They're going to by next week, and that's going to become a bigger and bigger say throughout the 20th century. So if that's the case, if there's this image of the cowboy as this guy who wants nothing, even though, as I said, the federal government is putting more into the West than into any other region, who cares? I mean, it's a great story, right? There's just these guys out there on horses doing their thing. Well, yes, but. There's always a yes, but when you do history. Yes, but. And that is that the West, as I outlined it yesterday, is not an important player in American politics in the immediate post-war years. It gives us a lot of imagery. It gives us the idea of indigenous peoples as somehow being savage. It gives us the idea of the individual cowboy standing against the communism of the East. But the West doesn't have voters. It doesn't have, it has organized governments that are generally territorial governments that have been organized by the United States government, but it's not a player in Eastern politics. So what they think out there, and the resurrection of the image of the American cowboy, really doesn't matter very much until it begins to matter really importantly after 1880. And the reason for this is that although nobody knows it at the time, and I'll walk you through how they figure it out, the South goes solidly Democratic. So after the election, the presidential election of 1876, when so many Southern Democrats keep African-American Republican voters and white Republican voters from the polls, after that, the South is going to go Democratic beginning in 1880, and it's going to stay Democratic until 1920 when Tennessee breaks ranks and votes for the Republic Harding in 1920. And because of that, because the South is solidly Democratic, the Republicans have a real problem, because the Republicans have always been a regional party, and they've been a Northern party, and they tried to build their party in the South among African-American voters, and they were enormously successful. But Southern Democrats are increasingly keeping Black Republican voters from voting. So those states start to go solidly Democratic, and this is known as the Solid South. That Solid South, as I say, is going to last for a really, really long time. It's not really going to break completely. I mean, as I say, there's this wavering in 1920, but it's not really going to break until Ronald Reagan. Goldwater opens up the door, but Ronald Reagan is really the one who breaks the Solid South once and for all. But this causes a real problem for the Republicans, because the Republicans are going to lose. They're going to lose national elections. And if you recall, Republicans really care about maintaining control, not simply because every political party wants to regain control or keep control, but also because their signal program is tariffs around the country that protect American business. And by the 1880s, by 1880 or so, those tariffs are protecting business to the point that businessmen can collude to raise prices. And those businessmen overwhelmingly are in the Republican Party, so they're funneling money into the Republican Party. And the Republicans come to believe that if they don't control society, it's going to be the apocalypse. If you let Democrats win, they're going to get rid of the tariffs, and the economy is going to collapse, and the entire country is going to fall into a muddle and fall apart. So the Republicans have a real problem. They recognize after 1880, they recognize that they're not going to be able to break into the South, and they don't think they're going to be able to break into the South again. So they've got to pick up new voters. Well, where are you going to pick up new voters after 1880? You're going to pick them up in the West. And so the Republicans start to look west to find new voters. And they actually begin not by looking at the regions I'm going to be talking about, but by looking at California, because California went Democratic in 1880, but it only did so by about 144 votes out of more than 160,000 votes cast. So if you're trying to flip a state, California is the place to go. Well, why do we care about this? We care about this because, as I've told you, California had a long history of discriminatory legislation against the Chinese. And as Republicans are starting to look toward California after the election of 76 and then dramatically after the election of 1880, they recognize that they've got to play into that racialized sentiment in California in order to pick up those 144 voters, but of course they want far more than that. So the Republican Party, which had stood so firm with Lincoln under the idea that all men were created equal and that everybody should have equality of opportunity and everybody should be equal before the laws, starts to change its tune. And it starts to change its tune really dramatically in 1879. And it does so because after, one of the things a lot of people don't know is after the Union Pacific Railroad joins the West Coast to the East Coast in 1869, that's going to throw California into a depression. And we all focus on the Depression of 1873. But it actually hits, the depression actually hits California in 1870. So California's been in this depression, and what they do in California is when this happens, of course, the Chinese workers who've been working on the railroad go back to California, primarily to the cities. And when they do that, that really ramps up anti-Chinese sentiment in California. And by 1877, you have the rise of a guy in California named Dennis Kearney, and Kearney was a drayman. He was he ran wagons that carried goods, and he was upset because the guys who ran the city of San Francisco, where he was, who were Republicans, wouldn't fix potholes, and you obviously broke wheels and everything when you hit potholes. And he initially tried to get together workers with the Chinese to say to the guys who ran San Francisco, you know, for God's sake, clean up their potholes. But quickly he realized you get a much bigger following if he turned people against the Chinese, whom the big employers like Leland Stanford had employed, especially on the Transcontinental Railroad, but also on the local railroads. And so by 1877, Kearney is giving speeches around San Francisco, and he's using a new tagline, and that new tagline is, quote, "The Chinese must go," unquote. So you've got this growing anti-Chinese sentiment in California around political issues right about the time that the Republicans need new Western votes. And this gets picked up in the Republican Party by James G. Blaine. You know, the old saying, Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the continental liar from the state of Maine. I feel a little bad saying that here in the state of Maine, but Blaine was a fascinating guy because he had like an instinctive sense of which way politics was going, and you see people who are like this. Just kind of know which direction to go. And he's a Republican, and as early as 79, he gets into the idea of ending Chinese immigration, which is what Dennis Kearney is calling for, and the anti-Chinese people are calling for in California, primarily Democrats. And the rest of the Republicans are like, you know, dude, this is not what we stand for. And he's like, no, this is the way we need to go. And after the Republicans lose California by so few votes in 1880, they switch behind this idea of limiting Chinese immigration. And so in 1882, a Republican president, Chester Arthur, it's probably the only time anybody's ever going to tell you about Chester Arthur, but Chet Arthur signs the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act is the first act in America that explicitly prohibits a certain group of people from immigrating to the United States. Now, interestingly enough, it's not all the Chinese. If you're a businessman or a diplomat or a scholar, you can come. But if you're an immigrant coming to work, you are not allowed into America. So you've got here the rise of exclusionary legislation, the very kind of thing that upset Abraham Lincoln to begin with in the 1850s, and William Seward, if you remember, is coming back into American society, the idea that some people really are better than others. In the wake of that Chinese Exclusion Act, you get a number of major riots against Chinese people in the West. The one that's the most famous, of course, is Rock Springs, Wyoming, when white miners become convinced that Chinese miners are undercutting their wages, and they murder 50 people, or as many as 50 people. We don't have the exact number. Nonetheless, this doesn't work. It doesn't give the Republicans enough power, enough voters in the West that they need. So they do something else. In 1884, the Democrats win, and they put Grover Cleveland into the White House. And the Republicans are terrified because Cleveland is elected on a policy of getting rid of the tariffs, or at least lowering the tariffs, reforming the tariffs, as he says. And he's not able to do it because the Republicans continue to hold the Senate. So even though he tries to get legislation through, it can't go because of the Republicans in the Senate. They kill it dead. So as soon as Cleveland is elected, and this is a really big deal because Cleveland is the first Democrat elected after the Civil War, of course, although Tilden had the popular vote in 1876. And it's actually going to matter in a little bit about Cleveland. But when this happens, the Republicans who care so deeply about the tariff are gobsmacked, and they want to do anything they can to make sure a Republican is elected in 1888. And in fact, they managed to make sure a Republican is elected in 1888, even though Benjamin Harrison loses the popular vote by about 100,000 votes. They managed to do a little bit of finagling in the Electoral College, probably corruption, actually. Whatever. A different story sometime if we continue these and you want to hear stories about the Electoral College, I'll tell them to you. But Harrison wins in the Electoral College, but he loses by a popular majority of 100,000, which is no small potatoes. So especially when Garfield, for example, won by less than 7,000 votes. So sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. Everything is clear and fine at my end, but it just quit. All right. So and I can tell you guys were worried about that, because I know your days would not be complete without hearing more about the dark side of Benjamin Harrison, which you're about to hear about. Anyway, so hang on a second, because one of the things that did drop was the order in which I wanted to tell you guys about this stuff. And it'll be a lot better if I know where I am. Okay, here we go. So Harrison's people get Harrison into the White House, but they recognize they've got a huge problem for the future, because the Democrats clearly have the popular vote that they need. So what they do is something extraordinary. Over the course of 1889, Harrison takes office in March of 1889, and over the course of 12 months, between 1889 and 1890, the Republicans bring 6 new states into the American Union. That's the largest acquisition of states that America is going to have, aside from the original 13. And it all happens in a 12-month period between 1889 and 1890. And this should 100% be in every classroom across the country, because that admission of those 6 new states was explicitly, they said it to the newspapers, they said it in Congress, they said it in their private letters. It was explicitly designed to guarantee that a Republican could never again lose the Electoral College, and that the Senate would always stay Republican. And the reason for that is that the Western Territories, people kind of had an idea of how Western Territories would vote, and the Republicans. There's kind of a backstory here. The Democrats and Republicans had been fighting ever since the Civil War about letting in new states that they thought would favor them. And during the Cleveland administration, they had come to agree to, they would divide it so that it's sort of like the Missouri Compromise. The Democrats would get some states and the Republicans would get others. But when Harrison wins and he gets the House and Senate as well, the Democrats realize that they better cut the best deal they possibly can. And they cut a deal for 4 new states. And the idea is that one of those states, Montana, is probably going to be Democratic. And the Republicans say, well, we can get it. And actually they do. When there's an election, the first election in Montana, the Republicans in Congress simply say, well, it was a rigged election. The Democrats didn't really win, and they put their own people in. So Montana's going to go Republican as well. But they take the territory of Dakota, and they split it into 2 states, North Dakota and South Dakota. And then they add North Dakota, South Dakota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington is the other one that they admit early on, the first 4. And the idea is that the Republicans are going to get 2 senators for each of those states, so that's 4 of them, and plus 1 representative. So theoretically, that's going to be another person in Congress for them. Most importantly, that's going to be 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 new people in the Electoral College. So a Republican should win the Electoral College from then on. And then it turns out that's not enough. So in 1890, they add Idaho and Wyoming. And Idaho and Wyoming had, they were in such a hurry to let in Idaho and Wyoming that, in fact, they simply didn't even do a real constitutional convention for Idaho. They called for volunteers to write a state constitution. And so they showed up and wrote a state constitution, and then the voters approved it. And so we got North Dakota, South Dakota, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, all in 12 months. Because these 6 new states were designed to swing the Electoral College and the Senate to the Republicans forever. And again, it's worth thinking about. I'm going to talk more about those states in a minute. It's worth thinking about the fact those states still have a disproportionate effect on our politics compared to their size and their population. And I really don't have time to go into the history of the formation of those states because there's so much else to do today. But I do want to point out that Mount Rushmore was an attempt to draw settlers, to draw tourists and draw settlers into South Dakota because there was nobody there. And even after it became a state. And so it's kind of the original a tourist site, not the original, but an early tourist site. And that's why Mount Rushmore is in South Dakota. Anyway, so what happens is that the Republicans think that they've done it, that they're going to win elections from now on in a big way. And they do it in part to protect a tariff that they pass in October of 1890. They know they're going to actually be reforming the tariff by raising it, not by lowering it. But in fact, it doesn't play that way at all because voters are so angry with that new tariff in the West there's a couple of other things going on in the West too, that they actually turn against the Republicans and they give the House of Representatives to the Democrats by a 2-to-1 margin, and they make the Senate hang on one seat. And that's what my book, about the Wounded Knee Massacre, is about, is the story of that one Senate seat and how that played out in the deaths of over 200 Lakota and Cheyenne peoples. But anyway, the interesting thing for our purposes today that happens after the admission of these 6 states and after that, that election of 1890 is that the Republicans realize they're in real trouble. They're in real trouble if the West is going to go Democratic as well. So they tried to pass a law protecting black voting in the South, known as the Federal Elections Bill. And we've paid a ton of attention to the Federal Elections Bill and how angry that Southerners got about the Federal Elections Bill. And usually it's white Southerners who are credited or discredited with killing the Federal Elections Bill. But in fact, it's Western voters who add their votes to Southern voters to kill that bill. And what Western voters say, Western congressmen say when they're discussing the Federal Elections Bill after the election, they say, we don't want Chinese people to vote. We sure don't want Indians to vote. Why should white Southerners have to have African Americans vote? And all of a sudden there is this weight shift where Westerners are starting to look at Southerners and saying, you know, we have a lot in common with you. And that's going to play out in the rest of the rest of American history, but certainly the rest of today and the rest of the 19th century. Because what happens is immediately after the election of 1890, and this was something I discovered that I've never seen anyone reference, I would love to see commentary about it if anybody knows about it, is that Westerners, along with Mississippi, joined together to create a new governmental system. And what they did is they formed something called the TransMississippi Congress. Quickly, it's going to change to the Trans-Mississippi Commercial Congress. But the Trans-Mississippi Congress it gets delegates from all over the West, plus Louisiana, and it pulls them together, and they organize without regard to party, but only with regard to their Western interests. And what they say is that the West is the future of America. Like the East was important before, now it's all about the West. And the West is going to hold the key to the American future. And it needs some things to do that. It needs more states. They're going to agitate for states. It needs water development, and you're going to hear more about that next week. And it needs a canal across what is then Nicaragua. And they're going to be, it's the Isthmus of Panama at the time, but it's going to break off. I'm sorry, it's not going to break off from Nicaragua. They're also looking at a canal in Nicaragua. It's going to break off from Colombia. Panama was a part of Colombia at the time. But it's known as the Isthmus of Panama, and they want to put a canal either across Nicaragua or Panama in order to make it easier for the West to develop by water to the Atlantic states. Anyway, so while this is going on, while the West is increasingly seeing itself as a political entity, again, the idea behind the original settlement or organization of those Western territories by the Republicans during the Civil War on indigenous land was that these would be sort of small farmers, Republican people working on the land, the way the Northerners really thought of American democracy. But the realities of life in the West meant that the economic system in the West was far more like that of the American South. So the idea, again, was the idea of these small farmers in the West, but there were really never small farmers in the West because of the geography of the Great Plains and also the mines and the mills. What tended to happen in the plains and in the Western states was that there were very few extractive industries or things that mimicked extractive industries like cattle, like agribusiness. We're really never going to have small farms in the West, like mining. And pretty soon, like oil, that all require really high levels of capitalization. And that is, high levels of capitalization almost always mean that there develops an economy based around a single or a few very wealthy people who can control money, and they need a lot of workers, and generally a lot of underskilled workers. Not unskilled, there's really very little unskilled work anywhere in the world ever, but people who are interchangeable, who are usually migrants or are poor or are people of color, and who are easily exchanged. And so what happens is that when Americans first moved to the West, across the Mississippi River after really the 1820s, but after the war, what they do, and after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, is they move into a land that has already been shaped really significantly, first by the Spanish and then by the Mexicans who have that land until 1848. And it is a system that is based on large land holding with a few leaders in it. And it tends to have sometimes enslavement and sometimes debt peonage, but a system of hierarchies. And far from wanting to get rid of those hierarchies, as I talked about before with the rise of mining, American settlers love those hierarchies. It means that they can take land from the Indians and they can push Mexicans off the mining fields, either literally pushing them off or by lynching them. And they are not ones to walk in and say, oh, never mind, we'll make everything out here more equal, especially in the 1850s when all this is happening and when there's such pressure back east. So there's already that system there. And then when Americans move west after the Civil War, they get involved in these industries that, as I say, are very heavily capitalized. And what that means is that the people who get power in the West are not the little farmers that are idealized back east, but rather people who have connections to bankers, who can bring money into the territory, who can go ahead and figure out ways to capitalize in a mine, for example, where, again, you have the image of, the miner 49er, but the reality is mines are operated primarily by large corporations who can afford to sink shafts and to afford the timber to sink the shafts and to pay the wages. And the old saying is, it takes a gold mine to develop a silver mine. And the real money out there was not for the guy who was digging with his pick. The real money out there was for the people who actually owned the corporations, or the lumber to provide for the mills, or the railroads to move the ore in and out. And it was that way across every industry, not just mining, although that starts during the war itself, even before, but really during the war. Cattle are the same way. Cattle are really run by cattle barons who are highly capitalized. And the same can be true, can be said of farming, because again, we have this idea of the small Western farmer, but there never was a small Western farmer, because you really can't farm efficiently on the plains until you get irrigation, until you get somebody to get water up to the surface. And that's going to require, in the West, that's going to require buying water from irrigation companies from the very beginning. And of course, that's going to change and become a government part of the government's actions after, especially in the 20th century. And again, I'm going to tell you more about that next week. But what it means is that this whole image of the Western farmer like Pa Ingalls is really never a reality. And all of those things, including farming, depend on migrant workers or on poorer workers. So from the beginning in the West, we have Japanese American workers, really at least by the turn of the century, and especially Mexican or Mexican American workers traveling around to sugar beet farms, for example, providing the migrant labor or the cheap labor to make these industries possible. And historians who look into these Western industries say that, in fact, they look virtually identical in terms of the capitalization and in terms of the workers and who the workers are and the conditions under which they work and how much they make. They are absolutely analogous to Eastern workers working in the factories. But again, we have this idea that out West, it's this free, wonderful country, and it's back East, people are sort of chained to U.S. Steel, which, by the way, isn't going to capitalize for a while. I brought that anachronistically back into the period I'm talking about, but they're working for big corporations. But the reality is the West pretty much looks the exact same way. So what this means is that the West is the West really reinforces the power of a few very wealthy men, and the population out there stays quite sparse, and politics tends to revolve around the men who, as I say, can deliver money and who are going to be able to deliver national political power to these regions. And that's a really interesting part about these territories. If you think about American settlement until now, until the late 19th century, American settlement has tended to creep across the continent according to to settlement. You know, you get a bunch of people go into a territory and it becomes a state in a year or two. California is a great, and then there's this leap over the country to the west. California does the same thing. People start to pour in 1849. There's so many by 1850 they have to organize. Those states in the middle, or those territories in the middle, if you remember, Congress organizes them really quickly during the Civil War as either states or territories. But then they sit in limbo for a generation. You know, you get the organization of these things in the 1860s, early 1860s. And by 1890, some of them are still territories. Well, what does that mean? That means that the power in those proto-states or those territories doesn't sit in the state itself. It sits back east in Congress. And the people who manage to gain power in those Western territories are people who can leverage national government power into their states. And that's not going to be some farmer like Pa Ingalls. That's going to be a mine owner who's hobnobbing with these guys, who goes back east and shares cigars with John Sherman. It's not going to be the regular people. Well, it seemed at first to a lot of Americans that, can I just say, isn't this cool? Like it's a whole, like, all right. It's just a whole new way to look at American history. Anyway, these 6 new states seemed like they could change everything. They could be game changers, right? They could democratize the system because theoretically you got all these little farmers out there, and you do have a lot of little farmers out there who are really not making it. But you know, they're trying. You know, they're going out on these land rushes, and at first, if you remember what I said a few minutes ago, in 1890, in that first election in which the new states I talked about could vote, the farmers and the miners did in fact manage to take over control of the House of Representatives and really almost take over the Senate. And it seemed like they should have been making a huge difference. And in 1892, they organized as the People's Party, which we know as the Populist Party. These people who are going to take back American government from the very wealthy. You know, this is the time when Mary Elizabeth Lease talks about farmers, telling farmers they should raise less corn and more hell. And they met in 1892, delegates to the Populist Party, and complained that, quote, the fruits of the toil of millions are boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few, unprecedented in the history of mankind. And the possessors of these in turn despise the Republic and endanger liberty. And the populists wanted, as they said, to restore the government of the people to the hands of the plain people, with which class it originated. And it seemed like they were really going to change the American political equation. And Lord knows, writing books about the populists has become a cottage industry in American history. But 1892, while it's the birth of the Populist Party coming out of the alliance movement of the 1890s, that's the year that the West demonstrates just how thoroughly people of capital control both their own political system, but also link into the political system of the rising industrialists back east. So in 1892, we have 2 really dramatic things that happen in the West. The first is in Wyoming, and it's known as the Johnson County War. And the Johnson County War, by the way, if anybody, I don't think I'm going to talk, I guess I didn't talk at all about the Lincoln County War, but if anybody ever wants to remember how you remember the Lincoln County War versus the Johnson County War, they happened in the same order as Lincoln and Johnson. So the Lincoln County War is before the Johnson County War. So I'm going to talk about the Johnson County War of 1892. And other than that, they're really not related. But I always used to get them confused, and that's how I remember them now. The Johnson County War happened obviously in Wyoming, and there's this terrible winter in 1886 to 1887, and the terrible winter of that year kills about 90% of the cattle herds that are up in the plains, especially in the northern plains. And when that happened in Wyoming, and when that happens, the big cattle herders need a lot of grazing land to try and recover their herds. And so a group of them in Wyoming, known as the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, mind you, look at that word right now, stock growers as opposed to farmers, for example. Anyway, in the spring of 1892, they hired 50 gunmen from Texas to come up and murder the smaller farmers the smaller cattlemen that were on the turf that they wanted to claim for themselves. And they literally gave these guys a list of the men that they wanted murdered. I mean, talk about impunity. You know, they literally gave them a list, which I got to tell you, I just can't get my mind around. You know, here's a list of 70 guys we want to kill. They called them rustlers, but they were actually all small-time cattlemen and settlers in Johnson County. And the gunmen did, in fact, manage to kill 2 of them. They set fire to a cabin they were hiding in, and then they killed them. But one of them actually gets a message out to the people surrounding the cabin. So we know a lot about what was going on there. And when that happened, after the gunmen killed the guy in the cabin, the settlers come and they surround the gunmen and say we're going to hang all of you guys. And the law enforcement then comes in and they side with the settlers, not with the Texas assassins. And the stock growers then realize their own guys are in trouble, and they turn around and they appeal to the governor. And the governor runs to Benjamin Harrison. He runs to the president, and the president sends in the army to break up what he calls an insurrection in Johnson County. And the army officers rounded up the guys that the stock growers had hired. But the governor then, so the army's got the assassins in hand, but the army then orders them held in Cheyenne, the state capital, and that's also the headquarters of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And they were never locked up. They were allowed to carry their guns. They boasted about going back to Johnson County to finish their job. And gradually they were released before trial, and key witnesses were intimidated into not showing up to testify. And basically the big stock growers, with the help of the governor and the federal government, got away with murder. I mean, that's just an astonishing thing. That's not the only thing that happens in 92. An industrial standoff in Wyoming, I'm sorry, in Idaho, in Idaho on the Coeur d'Alene River ends fairly similarly. The coal mine, the mine owners lowered wages, the miners strike, the owners get an injunction against the strike. When that happens, they will be able to bring in non-union labor. The miners object. The local governments sympathize with the miners, the small guys, not with the big guys. The owners once again turn to the governor for support, and Harrison once again mobilizes the Idaho National Guard, declares martial law in the area, claims that the strikers are in domestic insurrection. The army arrests about 300 of the strikers, and got rid of the local sheriff as well on the grounds that he was, quote, acting in the interests of his friends, the strikers, to whom he owed his election, unquote. Well, they made that sound like it was something bad, but yes, he did owe his election to the strikers because they voted for him. They were a majority of the voting base, of course, in that region. But the mine owners and the people who back the mine owners have gotten it in their heads that the exercise of the franchise by people who don't want their system of control is illegitimate. That even though the sheriff was legally elected, he shouldn't have been elected. He shouldn't have been sheriff, and they get rid of him because of that. So they sound in this a lot, if you think about it, like people like Andrew Carnegie, who in 1889 is going to write The Gospel of Wealth. It's not called that at first. It's called just Wealth, I believe. And he publishes it not as a book, but in a magazine, in a series of sets, but in a series of articles. But he says in that civilization depends on the sacredness of property. Again, very much an echo like that Confederate ideology I talked about before. And he said that the elites accumulated property, which was put to much better use than if it had been frittered away among workers. Again, very similar to what James Henry Hammond says in his Mudsill speech. And Carnegie goes on to say that the alternative to this system was communism. And communism, again, this is 1889, long before the Bolshevik Revolution. Communism will kill initiative and destroy property. And he went on to say that, quote, the best interests of the race are promoted by the system of individualism, which inevitably gives wealth to the few. And this, of course, is a sentiment that is growing in the West as well as in the East. And it really is put into American law by a Westerner, by Stephen J. Field, who's a Supreme Court justice, who writes more opinions than almost any other Supreme Court justice in American history, and who insisted, in his own words, that the primary law of America was not the promotion of equality, but rather the protection of property. All right, so so this is possible. This redefinition or the reading out of certain people from American society is once again possible by the rising image of the Western individualist in the form of that cowboy. And if you think about it, this is the same era as we get the rise of Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, which, you know, Buffalo Bill is William F. Cody, and he gets the nickname Buffalo Bill in 1883 when he is killing bison for the Kansas Pacific Railroad to feed the crews. And he finally figured out that it would be way easier and he'd make a lot more money if he sort of turned himself into a showman rather than a hunter for buffalo. And he is not alone. The Buffalo Bill's Wild West show is the very most famous one, but there are lots of Wild West shows. And individuals take these Wild West shows back east to pull in money from Easterners who want a taste of that Western experience they're hearing so much from. And if you think about what happens at the Wild West shows, and by the way, if you're interested, there are clips on YouTube of the Wild West shows. They used to walk through a city when they went into it, so so people could get a look at the characters in it. And there's some clips of that on YouTube now, very short, but it's just kind of bizarre to watch, you know, Indians in war dress walking through New York City. There's clips from the original Edison Company, I think it is. Anyway, Buffalo Bill created a world by pulling together former cowboys and former cowboys and indigenous peoples together into a highly staged individualistic vision of what the West looked like. So, for example, his West is all about buffalo hunts and wild Indians and brave white men who are riding horses. You know, the cowboys I talked about. There are no stock growers, there are no miners, there are no migrant workers. You have this vision of America as this group of heroic white men who are putting down savages and bringing civilization to this turf, to this new territory. And the cowboys that he employs are called the Rough Riders. Well, this image takes over American society to the point that if he's operating, if Cody is bragging, is by 1887, Cody brags, you know, I kick worse than any quartermaster's mule ever kicked if I don't clear $1,000 a day. That's pretty close to a quotation. He's making bank is what he's saying by 1887. This idea of American individualism as being the centerpiece of what it means to be an American takes off not only through the Buffalo Bill, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and the other Wild West shows, but also academically, because in 1893, you're going to get this incredibly important piece of literature in American history written by a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. And Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a paper at the AHA, the American Historical Association's yearly meeting in 1893, that interpreted all of American history through this vision of the Western individualist. And the historians were meeting that year in Chicago because it was the year of the Columbian Exposition, and basically they all wanted to go to the Columbian Exposition. And one of my favorite stories about Frederick Jackson Turner's presentation of this paper, he's a young man, and basically the historians wanted to go to the exposition. They didn't really want to sit around and hear papers, so he gives this paper. And of course, nobody expects much. He's a good historian, but you know, it's just a paper at a conference, right? His parents are in town to go to the Columbian Exposition, and they don't even bother to hear him give the paper, which I love. But anyway, he gives this paper that redefines American history from the perspective of this Western individualist. So what he says is that, you know, in the past, we've always thought that American democracy came from great thinkers like John Adams and Samuel Adams and Thomas Jefferson, but no, American democracy comes from individuals on the frontier. It's the ordinary man on the frontier who creates American democracy. And what's fascinating about this thesis is he gives us the year after the populists have tried to take back American democracy in the West. And he gives it exactly at a time when you've got the rise of, you know, the stock growers who are murdering people in Johnson County, and the Coeur d'Alene mine owners and the cattle barons. And excuse me, the mine owners and the cattle barons. And he, while all this is going on, he redefines American democracy as coming from these individualists, not from organized labor. And he forgets the idea, and not from populists, and he pretends that these fabulously wealthy Westerners don't exist. Indeed, what he does is he harks back to Daniel Boone and Kit Carson. He uses them both, talks about them both by name in the Frontier thesis. And he says they're the ones that have made American democracy, not the people who are trying to organize, for example, the Populist Party, which he ignores entirely. But he also mirrors the American individualist entirely in the Frontier thesis. His thesis is white men. It does have some immigrants, but they tend to be German immigrants. There are no people of color. When he refers to slavery, he calls it an incident. It's not terribly important. Let that one sink in for a minute. He doesn't talk about Mexican people. He doesn't talk about Chinese people. The Indians are only there as a foil for the white men who are gathering together on the frontier and reinventing democracy as they need to build communities in the wilderness. Crucially as well, there's no women. You know, for all the fact that his male individualists theoretically are building societies, they're doing it without any women in them. Which again, as we know our American history, the West is, women are at least as important as in the West as they are anywhere else. That in fact, there's wonderful work now by people who say what really made you a successful Westerner was being able to have kinship ties, and those are cemented through marriage. And certainly the fur traders, the early fur traders and the later fur traders, and a lot of the business people of the 19th century make it because they have cemented family ties to Mexican families, to indigenous families, whatever, through marriage, and because of the women in those communities. But none of that is in Turner. They're all invisible. The frontier, Turner says, carries with it individualism, democracy, and nationalism. And those are all Republican principles that he associates with white men. Everybody else is read out of that. And he talks about how this is natural American democracy, and it's corrupted when you get a real society that requires taxes. That once you get taxes in a place, you have essentially gotten rid of democracy, and it has fallen back into something that looks like communism to him, although he doesn't use that word. So Turner insists that as settlements develop in the East and settlement presses west, democracy continues to flow westward. This is the heart of our concept of American exceptionalism, the idea that America is different than anywhere else because we did have a frontier that enabled people to redevelop democracy. So even now when anybody talks about American exceptionalism, they're harking back to Turner. But there's more to it than that, because Turner wrote in 1893 because he was very concerned because of something that happened in 1890. And in 1890, the census of 1890 was so incredibly corrupt that it took forever to get it done. And even now we don't have it because shortly after it was taken, it burned. There you go. I am so skeptical of that. And then they put the fire out with water at a time when everybody was using fountain pens. So the numbers we have for the census of 1890 are preliminary numbers that were submitted ahead of the official census. And of course that census was enormously important to the Republicans because that's what they said would prove that it was worth putting those 6 states into the Union, because they were going to discover they had all kinds of people. Well, they didn't have all kinds of people. Even now, there's very few people in those states. So my suspicions about those, there were a lot of suspicions even at the time that that census was deliberately destroyed because the Republicans were then going to have to admit they'd let in states that didn't have any people in them. But what this means is because the census is so late, the census director, when he finally turns the sucker in, is in a hurry. The original census director had to resign because he did such a bad job, and the second census director cuts corners where he can. And always in the census had been, here's a section on the frontier, said here's where the frontier line is. And the guy's in a wicked hurry, and he says, I'm not going to write that section. He just puts it, he goes, we can say the frontier line is closed. Well, Frederick Jackson Turner picks that up, and he goes, wait a minute. If democracy is made on the frontier and the frontier is closed, what's going to happen to American democracy? And that was the central question of Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. So how does this play out? Well, it matters because Teddy Roosevelt is now back in New York City. He'd been out in Dakota Territory after his wife and mother died. I think I told you about that in 1884. But his cattle get decimated by that bad winter along with everybody else's. So he moves back east and goes back into politics. And he believes that Frederick Jackson Turner is on to something, although I have to laugh. He writes to Frederick Jackson Turner about the thesis, and he says, you know, I think you're on to a lot of good ideas that have been widely circulating. And then he says something to the effect of, you did a really good job, except I think I could have done a better one. And I'm paraphrasing there, but it's so Teddy Roosevelt. Anyway, he was very concerned that, in fact, Turner was right, that democracy was going to collapse because there was no longer any frontier. And Roosevelt gets very concerned about the idea of oligarchs taking over American society. And he was desperate to regain that democratic virtue of the cowboy. Well, in 1897, Roosevelt becomes Assistant Secretary to the Navy. There's a really cool story behind that, but I don't have the time to tell it to you now. Again, if we decide to do more of these, maybe I'll tell stories like that. But the next year in 1898, he found a way to restore American values to the American government that was increasingly, he thought, becoming controlled by a very few wealthy men. And that was by going into Cuba. Cuba, which lies right off the coast of Florida, of course, was at the time a Spanish colony. And Cubans had been trying to get rid of their Spanish rulers repeatedly since about 1868. And by 1878, the island was in ruins. The crops were destroyed. About 80,000 Cubans had been killed. About 80,000 Spanish troops had been killed. And in order to pay for that war, the Spanish tripled the taxes on the Cuban islands. And that by 1895, the Cubans were desperate, and they launched a guerrilla war. To get rid of, or to stop the guerrilla war, a new commander on the Cuban island named Valeriano Weyler reconcentrated all of the Cubans into fortified towns that were guarded by soldiers and surrounded by barbed wire. And they said anybody who didn't come in to be concentrated into these camps, and I'm doing that deliberately, so we're in concentrado policy, would be considered a rebel and would be hanged. But this precipitated a humanitarian crisis. Anytime you crunch people together, you're going to create deaths, even if you are not intending to. A concentration camp is exactly that. You're concentrating people. A death camp is when you concentrate them for the purpose of killing them. But almost always concentration camps lead to very high rates of death. I got very involved in a fight about that on Twitter over what's happening on our borders with the refugees there. Anyway, towns couldn't handle the influx of refugees who came in, and people were starving and dying of disease. And increasingly, people like Roosevelt believed that it would be a humanitarian decision to go into Cuba and to get rid of the Spanish there, but also that it would help Americans rebuild their sense of morality and individualism. And the American industrialists didn't want to go into Cuba at all. They wanted the Spanish to stay in control in Cuba because they wanted the island pacified so that their business interests, they were heavily invested in sugar, among other things, would be safe under the Cubans rather than, under the Spanish rather than the Cubans. But people like Teddy Roosevelt were like, no, we need to go in and have a war for the good of America. And he in fact, when Congress declares war on Cuba after the explosion of the USS Maine in February of 1898, Teddy Roosevelt resigns from the Navy, and he goes ahead and gets a commission to raise a regiment to fight in the Spanish-American War as cowboys. They're known in the papers as a cowboy regiment, and he claimed that he was pulling together people from all walks of life, from indigenous peoples to Harvard men to people of color to immigrants to fight for American principles. And he made it a big point to write repeatedly about the fact that these Rough Riders, as they became known from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, it's the same name, that those Rough Riders were just true Americans who wanted to work hard and fight for good and morality without the interference of government. And in fact, Teddy Roosevelt gets very angry when his men are in Cuba, and they are dying of disease after the fighting is over, and the U.S. government can't get its act together to get them out of there. He goes straight to the newspapers, and the newspapers then cause such a stink, his people get out. And that's the story that people have tied to Admiral Crozier from the USS Roosevelt in the last few weeks. And Teddy Roosevelt boasted of the fact that he had gone through layers of government bureaucracy, which in those days, government papers were tied together with a red ribbon known as red tape. So Teddy Roosevelt had cut through that. He'd cut through red tape in order to get his men out safely. So he had this idea of the Rough Riders as being this image of America. And he fantasized, or he had these books about, or these speeches in a book about how they were regular Americans and they were all treated equally. Privately, he complained bitterly about what he called the smoked Yankees, the black soldiers. But he had this vision where he tried to sell this vision that they had gone from being a valueless mob, as he said, to America's finest simply by virtue of the fact they were Western individualists. But, and in fact, people rallied to this, by the way. They're huge volunteers for this war. And even though I really don't have time to tell you about this, I'm going to say it. I get so frustrated hearing everyone talk about how the U.S. Army pulled the troops out of the South after 1877. The U.S. Army never pulled the troops out of the South. They launched into the Spanish-American War from Southern installations. You can see charts on this, but that's one of my pet peeves. Anyway, so the problem with this, and the reason I want to mention this, is that even before the war in Cuba broke out, Teddy Roosevelt said to the Secretary of the Navy was on vacation, typical of Roosevelt, good timing. So as Assistant Secretary, Teddy Roosevelt said to the commander of the Asiatic Fleet, the American Asiatic Fleet, Commodore George Dewey, he said, the minute we declare war on Spain, I want you to go take the Philippines. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. He was actually in Hong Kong at the time, but he steams over toward the Philippines, and he takes the Philippines in the Battle of Manila Bay really very quickly. And that's when we get the famous line from the USS Olympia when Dewey says, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." And by the way, that ship is now in Philadelphia, and you can go see it, and it's totally cool. It's one of my favorite sites. Anyway, so when they're in the Philippines, at first the Americans begin to work with insurgents in the Philippines who were trying to throw off Spanish rule there, people under Emilio Aguinaldo. But very quickly, the Americans come to fight against Aguinaldo because they want control of the Philippines. Because while industrial interests did not want Cuba, they did not want the war in Cuba, they desperately wanted the Philippines, because the Philippines are an excellent way station on the way to Asia. They are also, they also grow sugar, and sugar is unbelievably profitable in the late 19th century. So there's this war, a very racialized war that looks much like an early Vietnam for America. But in the process of taking the Philippines, the Americans had decided early on that the war in Cuba was going to be for humanitarian reasons, and they had agreed not to take control of that island, although they did have a lot of influence in writing the Constitution of Cuba. But when they took the Philippines, there was something really sort of that illustrated this growing idea that there are some people who are equal and some people who are not. And the taking of the Philippines writes that idea of inequality into American law very similarly to the way that the Confederates would have liked to have done so before the Civil War. So the way this happens is that when America goes ahead and takes the Philippines after the Philippine War, it's got a real problem, because the sugar growers want to be able to bring in American sugar from the Philippines, or bring in sugar from the Philippines without paying tariffs on it. New tariffs have been put in place in 1890 under the McKinley tariff. But they don't want the people. They don't want those black and brown people. So what are you going to do? Well, what they decide to do is they go in front of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is a place where the industrialists have been able to cement their power with Stephen Field, among other people, to try and control the government, even although they don't control the popular vote any longer. So the Supreme Court does a couple of things. From 1901 to 1903, the Supreme Court decides a number of cases known as the insular cases, insular referring to islands, of course. And with the insular cases, the U.S. government I'm sorry, the U.S. Supreme Court comes up with the doctrine that America can hold territories. These will be unincorporated territories. Unlike all the states that come in after the Northwest Ordinance in the 1700s that says that that any territory of America is eventually going to become an equal state. The Supreme Court says, no, we can hold unincorporated territories. And what that will mean is that you're going to be able to get their goods without paying tariffs, but their people will not necessarily have any rights. And this is the doctrine, as I say, of unincorporated territories. And the Supreme Court holds that they are domestic territory, but they are not part of the United States. And in one of my favorite quotes in American history, that they are foreign to the United States in a domestic sense. All right, so on the heels of that, what about the people who live in those new territories? This comes to a head in the early 19th century when a pregnant woman from Puerto Rico, one of the unincorporated territories that are taken with the settlement over the Philippines, we get Samoa as well, and a bunch of other places too. When she comes to, a woman named Isabel Gonzalez, when she comes to America, she's pregnant, she's coming to meet her fiance, she's turned away because they say, coming from Puerto Rico, she's not a citizen and she's going to be dependent on the public purse because she's pregnant and she's not married. And she sues and she wins. Because what the Supreme Court says in Gonzalez v. Williams of 1904, what they say is that she is not a citizen of the United States. She's a national of the United States. And what that means is she can come into the continental U.S., but she does not have the rights of a citizen. She is, as they say, a non-citizen national. And what that does, the arrival of the concept of a non-citizen national, along with unincorporated territories, means that by the end of the 19th century, what Americans have done is that they have essentially written into American law the idea of a caste system, the idea that some people are better than others in America, the very principles against which Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party fought during the American Civil War. So over the course of the second half of the 19th century, we get this codification of the idea that castes belong in American society. And they do so in part because of that image of the American cowboy as the good American individualist. Now, that's been a lot of material, and I'm sure I'm leaving you with the question then, why did America not become an oligarchy at the turn of the century? All the pieces are in place. Why didn't they? And I'll take it up next week. I hope this was useful. I love this stuff, this late 19th century stuff nobody touches. By next week, we'll be into the 20th century, and stuff will look a little bit more familiar. There'll also be a lot more popular culture. Anyway, if you want to follow along with this in the book, which I always forget to advertise because it's this is just so much fun. The book is How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. Anyway, I hope this is fun, and if so, I'll see you next week. Thanks a lot.